Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, currently in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sandra J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to the 22nd jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider. We urge you, please, to ask your questions as and when they occur to you, so that there's not a backlog at the end. So, looking forward to this, the rhetoric and impact of two flamboyant has-beens, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Will they rise again? I wonder if we'll know at the end of the event. Anyway, with that, I hand over to Sandy and I'll disappear. I'll come back later.
Thank you, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Always good to do business together. We have a great panel this morning in the US, this afternoon in the UK. And just introduce them briefly. Karen DeYoung is senior national security correspondent and associate editor of the Washington Post, where she has worked for 4 decades. And Karen, most notably today, was the London correspondent for the Post about 15 or more years ago, in simpler times, one might say. And Karen, thanks for being with us. Also, Lauren Gambino, who is a political correspondent for the Guardian newspaper. She's based in Washington, and somewhat out of the ordinary for the Guardian. She is actually American, born and raised, but educated in part in the United Kingdom, and has a unique perspective on the two figures we were talking about today as a result. Mark Landler is, I might note in passing, a graduate of Georgetown University, and has worked for the New York Times for 27 years. He's had a number of important positions in Hong Kong, Frankfurt, as bureau chief, White House correspondent, and has been, I think, 5 years now, bureau chief in London, approximately.
3 years.
3 years. Okay, thank you, Mark. And then Rosina Sabur, who works for the Daily Telegraph of London in the United States as national correspondent, and is at the moment in Alaska, where she is on the trail of Sarah Palin, the former governor, former candidate for vice president, who is now a candidate for Alaska's congressional seat in the House of Representatives. And we'll have that additional perspective to report today. We have a lot to try to consider these two extraordinary characters on the Western democratic scene. And I think we want to do some comparing and contrasting of them. Karen, sitting where you do and where you used to, I think one of the important things is to try to balance our comparisons then with our comparison of the two systems of government and the difference in the role of President in the United States and Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And perhaps you can give us a very quick reminder of those differences.
You know, when I first arrived in London, which was early 1985, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and it was a sort of roiling time in this country. Ronald Reagan was president. And I remember thinking for the first 6 months or so that I was there, that oh my gosh, this is such a much more civilized system of government. You know, the prime minister has to come to Parliament every week and answer questions from people. There's lots of public debate and discussion. But then after about 6 months, I said, wait a minute, because Thatcher had a very large majority in Parliament at that time. And I thought, this is kind of licensed dictatorship. It's, you know, whatever she says goes. And in fact, the debates weren't real debates. And so I kind of switched my view of the advantages of a parliamentary system. But the systems are very, very different. In Britain, you know, there is no executive branch per se. There's no three branches of government with equal powers. The prime minister is a member of parliament. He is elected, to the extent that he's publicly elected, he is elected only in his district in parliament. And then the party that has the majority of members of parliament select the prime minister, and his cabinet is also selected from people who are elected he's selected by the party, cabinet selected by the party from members that have been selected in various voting districts. So you have a system where power is much less concentrated in one hand than it is here, where the president is independently selected, independently voted by popular vote, and has powers that are not dependent, and in some ways are in combat with Parliament. He has a veto power, which the prime minister does not have. The prime minister does have to go before Parliament once a week and answer questions publicly, which I think would be a really interesting thing. Would have been interesting when Donald Trump was president, if he had to appear before Congress once a week and answer questions from either party. The fact that his cabinet has to be chosen from elected officials means that you get an entirely different sort of group of cabinet officials in terms of expertise and in terms of what their ambitions are, since they too have to be elected again. So again, here the president can veto whatever Parliament does. The president has a fixed tenure. In Britain, as of this year, I guess, is the first time they've had a sort of fixed tenure for a government, which is 5 years. But the Parliament can vote to dissolve itself at any point, or can have a vote of no confidence in the prime minister. The prime minister then steps down, and the party in power then selects a new prime minister from elected officials.
And that's what's going on right now.
Yes.
In the UK. Karen, I apologize for having underestimated the length of time. How long ago it was you were in the UK? How quickly time flies.
I was there, yes, I was there for 5 years, 85 to 89.
So it was more like 33 years ago than...
it was a long time ago.
So quite a long time ago. And Mark, I wonder if you might, having covered the White House under Donald Trump, and I believe before that, for some period, Barack Obama, how you would contrast the two key figures we're talking about here, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that one of the reasons the New York Times was interested in sending me to London when they did is because I had covered Trump for 3.5 years, and they were very interested in the contrast. And, you know, back in 2018, 2019, there was a lot written about how Brexit and the Trump revolution, if you will, were all part of the same populist wave. And, you know, Trump himself contributed to this sense of parallelism by referring to Boris Johnson almost as a kind of a mini-me character. So that whole notion of the similarities between Trump and Johnson was a very live issue back in 2019. I actually wrote a few articles trying to debunk it on some level, because I think that it's easy to draw the parallel, and a little bit lazy as well. If you look at the two of them side by side, while there's no question that there are some tactical similarities, they both made use of kind of the tools of populism, if you will. They both brought the same kind of cynical take on the electorate and how to move people. Really, as people themselves, they're very different. Boris Johnson is, for all his foibles, a very educated man, a wide reader, someone who sprinkles his speech with references to Greek poetry and Shakespeare. Donald Trump is a guy who may not even have read the books he wrote, let alone any other books. And so he's a very different character. He's unschooled. Trump is a businessman with a very instinctive sense for other people. Boris, while he has an instinctive sense for people, came up in an entirely different way through journalism. As it happens, he was a columnist for The Telegraph. He was the editor of The Spectator. I'd also argue that they're different in another very important respect. For all the insurgents that seem to come from the Johnson government, the sense of it being an insurgency, Johnson is still fundamentally an establishment figure. He was educated at Oxford. He was the head of the Oxford Union. He went to Eton before that. He's basically hung around with high establishment figures in the Conservative Party for really his entire adult life, even while he was a journalist. Donald Trump is more authentically an insurgent figure in the sense that he was in the real estate business in New York City, but never a member of one of the great real estate families that sort of ran New York real estate. The Trumps, including his father, spent a lot of their time with their noses pressed up against the window, looking at elite society and elite business. And I think that left Donald Trump with a lingering sense that he was not a member of the establishment and really was fighting the establishment on behalf of, purportedly on behalf of the little guy. The same really can't be said of Boris Johnson. He used some of the tools of populism to assume power and push an agenda when he was in office, but he really always functioned from the very beginning as a member of the establishment, kind of climbing the greasy pole, whereas Trump, I would argue, was truly a much more if you will, disruptive figure, a guy who really wanted to come in and attack the establishment and break it down in a way that I think Boris Johnson never did, no matter how inflammatory his rhetoric could at times seem. He really never was that kind of figure in the way that Trump was.
Rosina, thanks a lot, Mark. Rosina, as somebody who's been covering Trump for The Telegraph, a newspaper that I believe has supported Boris Johnson by and large over time. How did you find yourself sort of explaining Donald Trump to the British?
Yeah, well, I mean, first I'd say far less supportive of Boris Johnson in the last few weeks and months than it has been in previous years. But I think the key thing that my editors tasked me with when I was sent out here to cover the Trump administration was just trying to explain what had happened. I think there's a great amount of intrigue from Brits about, how this quite bombastic figure had ended up in the White House, succeeding someone like Barack Obama. And there's just a lot of genuine interest about who he is, how he will behave, what it means for the world. And I think, as Mark said, that there aren't a lot of genuine similarities between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. People often mention the hair and, you know, the controversial phrases. But, you know, as Mark said there, that, you know, Boris Johnson is very much part of the British establishment in a way that Donald Trump isn't. And I think that one thing that really has struck out to me from, you know, going to all the Trump rallies and so on, there's a real anger, but you know, amongst American voters that Donald Trump really taps into and kind of channels. You know, the particularly striking moments I always found was when he'd recite this poem, you know, the snake poem, and you know, you'd be in the audience and people would be, you know, reciting it word for word, and there was a real visceral anger there that Donald Trump was really tapping into. And, you know, someone like Boris Johnson maybe will, you know, use grievance politics to form policies, but there isn't that same anger, I think, with Boris Johnson's approach as there is with Donald Trump's. And I think that's a real difference worth emphasizing.
Lauren, you in contrast have been an American explaining Trump to the UK. Of course, the Guardian, I believe, also has quite a lot of readers and followers in the United States as well. But where do you sit now in the attempt to compare the situations of the two countries in this? I mean, it's not a transition time officially in the United States, but I think the next midterm election, people are wondering, worrying, theorizing about what's going to happen. And that's just a few months away now, not even 3 anymore, I think. So where do you sit in this puzzle? You're on mute at the moment.
Thank you. Well, we actually have a lot of Americans working in our DC bureau. I'm not the only one. So we do have a mixed office, but I think I'm currently covering the midterms following the congressional midterms. And one thing we're certainly tracking is Trump's influence, which seems to still be very strong. He's had a few setbacks in terms of the candidates he's endorsed not winning, but overall, I think his endorsements still carry a lot of weight here. And I think we're finding that like you said, we do have an international audience that does pay attention to US politics, but we also have a US audience. So we kind of have to we have to sort of speak to both of these audiences, but we do find that there is a lot of interest in sort of where Trump is going, what his future prospects might be, because as we've kind of gone over, there is a lot of parallels, not just with the figures, but just with this populist movement, to kind of get a sense of where, is it ebbing? I always remember in 2016, right after the Brexit vote, Hillary Clinton's campaign convened a call immediately, and it was Bill Clinton who led the call, and he hadn't been very visible in her campaign, and he was very, they were desperately trying to downplay the impact. He was adamant, and then, we found out after that Bill Clinton saw that moment as kind of pivotal and thought, if the UK is going to vote for Brexit, then it's very possible here in the US that Trump could win. And at that time, even it was still the primaries, so Clinton hadn't even claimed the nomination, and she was running against her own populist candidate with Bernie Sanders. So I think there's been these parallels for a long time, and so I do get the sense that some of our audience is interested in is this fever going to break? But as we did go over, I think at the beginning with Karen's explanation, I think there are very real ways in which Donald Trump can sort of come back to power. I mean, I was just before this, I just checked the 2024 polls, and he still leads in the Republican primary in all of them. And midterms are definitely going to be sort of a test case for fellow Republicans who've still, never turned on Trump. Most of them have never turned on Trump, and I think they're watching very closely to see his influence and his power. They're watching the 2024 polls, and that will weigh heavily on, I think, on Trump's prospects within the party. But as we went over, I think Johnson charts a different political path, just partly because of the systems.
Right. This continuing power of Trump, a lot of people would argue, is fed in part by his constant coverage. I think there's literally not a day that passes that Donald Trump is not in one way or another in the news. Some would regard it as very negative and others positive. Karen, in sitting where you do, helping make decisions every day about what the very influential Washington Post is going to report upon, surely you hear all the time that people are fed up with hearing about Trump and with news about Trump, and yet they consume it very eagerly.
I think that you really can't compare the level of coverage now to when he was president. He's giving rallies all over the place all the time. He's giving speeches. We don't cover most of them. Somebody will listen in, but we normally don't write anything about it. I think most of the coverage now is on two levels. What Lauren was talking about, the whole endorsement thing for the party primary, the midterm elections that are coming up, who he's going to endorse and what leverage he has over that. And also the fact that he's mostly in the news now because of all this litigation, all these legal matters, civil litigation against his business, potential criminal charges, indictments, investigations on all kinds of levels. So I think that that's still investigations and litigations resulting from his really ongoing attempt to declare the last presidential election fraudulent. So I think we're sort of obligated to cover all of that, but we basically don't cover his sort of political musings and his own efforts to project himself as a future candidate. He's not on social media the way he used to be. He doesn't have the platforms that he used to have. So I think that the coverage of him as a political figure, except for whether he has the juice to get people elected to lower offices in the midterm elections, I think we're not covering him a lot.
Mark, do you see Boris Johnson, once this seems now like a long transition, probably it isn't historically speaking, but it's quite a while since we heard he was out. He's still prime minister until a new one is selected. Do you see him remaining a very significant public figure in the UK? Is he liable to be the object of criminal investigations and face some of the vulnerabilities that Donald Trump does?
Well, he does face at least one investigation in Parliament by the Privileges Committee, which is looking into whether he misled the Parliament in one of the several scandals that ended up costing him his job. This was, over these famous parties that were held at Downing Street in breach of COVID restrictions. So there's at least one ongoing investigation that will outlive his time in Downing Street. And I do think he'll remain a visible part of the national debate, because I would fully expect that he will reacquire a column at one of the newspapers, maybe Rosina's, but maybe somewhere else. He's going to be, probably making his views well known. He was a very widely read columnist before he was prime minister. He will perhaps finish the biography of Shakespeare that he's been contracted to write and hasn't yet delivered, and that'll probably only be the first of a few books we'll see from him. He also was a pretty telegenic and visible presence on TV prior to being prime minister. I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up on various shows. And so he's going to remain visible. I think what will be different is I don't think he will have the kind of king-making role that Karen just sketched out that Trump has with Republican nominees for lower office. I'm not sure getting the Boris seal of approval is going to be in any way analogous to what getting the Trump endorsement is in the United States. And for that matter, there's a little more of a precedent for people staying in politics, but kind of moving back to the backbenches in Britain than there is for former presidents in the United States, who tend to, retire to a life of building a presidential library and going on an expensive speaker circuit. In Britain, we have a current prime minister, Theresa May, who has been on the backbenches through the entirety of Boris Johnson's prime ministership. Johnson will be a member of parliament until the next election. And so he will go to the backbenches. Whether he chooses to show up and sit there and speak in parliamentary debates is something that's much discussed. But for at least the next couple of years, he could do that. Now, when you get to the next general election, his prospects become a little less certain, because as things now stand, according to current polling, he might not even win back the seat he currently holds in Parliament. So there's a question about Johnson's long-term political prospects. But, remember, Johnson's political hero is Winston Churchill. And Churchill left the prime ministership and came back and became prime minister again a few years later. So there's nothing to stop Boris Johnson from returning to politics on the national level, on the front benches, if he really wants to. And there's been plenty of speculation in the press over the past month about just that question. Have we seen the last of Boris Johnson as a national politician, or is this, in a sense, the end of chapter 1? There may be more time between chapters 1 and 2 than there would be between Trump Mark 1 and Trump Mark 2. But there's no question that we haven't heard the last of him. He will be an outspoken presence and a visible presence in British public life, for at least the next few years.
Can I just say that Trump, I think, Trump prospers on a sense of victimization, not only his own victimization, but the victimization of his followers. And so he has to keep them angry, and he has to be out there all the time as much as he can, telling them that they're victims, telling them that they're being cheated, telling them that their life as they know it is being ruined by the other side, and that they need to fight to take it back. So I think that I wouldn't see him writing a column, or I could see him.
He won't be writing a book about Shakespeare, that's for sure.
I could see him on TV. I mean, but his whole shtick is about, you are treated badly because you're white, because you're conservative, because you're not woke, because liberals and Marxists are taking your way of life away from you. So I think it's a much cruder, more direct, fear-based approach, and he's got to continue that in order to keep what he calls his movement going.
A good segue to you, Rosina, to ask what you're hearing in Alaska, what you're seeing. No place is typical, of course, and Alaska's very far away, but what's the word on Trump in Alaska?
Yeah, in Alaska, its politics is characterized predominantly by its independent streak. So it's known for being fiercely independent in its thinking. A lot of the people that I've spoken to are still incredibly supportive of Donald Trump, but interestingly aren't necessarily following his guidance in terms of who he's endorsing in the congressional race. So, I'm here covering Sarah Palin's bid to return to frontline politics with a bid for a seat in Congress. And many of the people I've spoken to here, still ardent Trump supporters, but do not like Sarah Palin, feel very betrayed by the fact that she quit the governorship 16 months before the end of her term after losing the 2008 presidential election. And they really aren't going to follow Donald Trump's lead in terms of voting for Palin. And when you ask them, why not? And they say, well, some will say, Donald Trump's a great guy and, but he's not a god and everyone makes mistakes in their decisions. Others will say, well, perhaps he hasn't spoken to Nick Begich, who's the kind of more Republican establishment candidate who is running against Palin. So it is interesting seeing, as Laura was mentioning earlier, Donald Trump has been a very large figure over the midterm elections, but you are seeing races where he's put a lot into, where his support base might be fully behind him, but not behind his kind of legacy candidates.
Lauren, thank you, Zena. This issue of what the impact of Trump will be, I wonder what you're reporting from your bureau about the FBI raid a week ago on his resort in Palm Beach, Florida, and the fact that long after his lawyers had said all the documents he took with him from the White House had been turned in, something like 11 or 12 boxes of them, and we don't, the reports keep saying boxes of documents and other things were taken from Mar-a-Lago. I don't know what those other things are, maybe someone does, but do you in your coverage of these matters, do you see a change in Trump's capacity to influence things when he's under, or does this help him? Does this enhance his capacity that he's now a martyr pursued by the FBI?
Well, that was the big question in the immediate aftermath of the raid, which he himself confirmed and portrayed it as an attack, a brazen attack. And I mean, he was correct; it is unprecedented what happened. But the more we learn, the more it seems to have been. This was not some, not a spur of the moment decision by Attorney General Merrick Garland, if you thought it was, but clearly this was a very serious matter. And I think it kind of gets to the heart of who Trump was as a president. He was very careless. He didn't think the rules applied to him. He, had contempt for decorum and process, and now you're seeing kind of incredible. It's really all coming into focus because these are, there are clear processes to handle, classified information. Some of them, from the reporting we've seen, some of the most highly sensitive material you could imagine. The Washington Post has said it could contain nuclear weapon material, and so you're seeing he was just. It appears that he was very careless with this, leaving it at his Mar-a-Lago resort in southern Florida that we know is not the most secure place. We've had people break in and get very close during his presidency. There were people that got very close to Trump who really should not have been anywhere near him. And so, I think in that sense, it does seem like those behaviors are finally possibly catching up to him. But if that translates to his political career, it's just so hard to tell, because immediately in the aftermath, we saw Republicans come out and double down and blame the FBI. Some have eased off of that now that we've known more details about, why the FBI did search Mar-a-Lago. But even then, there's still a lot of questions. I even had just in my email the other day, Susan Collins, one of the most moderate senators who, herself has stood up to Trump on multiple occasions. She's a Republican. Even she is calling, for more answers, more questions. So I think you see that there is this still uncertainty about how to approach something, even if the details and the facts of the case do seem pretty explosive and shocking, having potentially nuclear documents just scattered around Mar-a-Lago. But again, he does, again, it's the victimization. He plays on this. He's trying to use this to his benefit. One data point, though, this is still small, but I've sat in a lot of focus groups and some of the traveling I've done on the trail. It does seem like there is a sort of fatigue with these constant investigations. So voters love Trump. They really do still love him, but they think, you know what, maybe in 2024, maybe someone just who will, just cause less drama would be the better option. So his approval is still where it used to be, but people are starting to think, and that's where you have discussions of someone like the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis. So, how much Trump is still leading in all the polls. We're far out, but how much, that starts to chip away. There's just a constant churn of investigations and drama, and perhaps that starts to chip away at his support.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I wonder if you're struck as I am, and I just have to ask this question. As one who has written myself a lot about overclassification of documents, and was at the Washington Post at the time of the Pentagon Papers case, and have over the years been concerned about how much information has been kept from the American public about their business, their own business through the classification system. Now here I find myself and colleagues and others outraged by Trump's violation of the classification system. And not having respect for some admittedly highly classified documents, perhaps.
I think that it's interesting to look at the laws that were cited in the search warrant for Trump. They, to some extent, they didn't really depend on the classification of the documents. They depended on laws that say presidential documents belong to the nation. They don't belong to the former president. It doesn't, in some senses, it doesn't matter if information was classified or not classified. You're not allowed to take documents that are work product from the White House. No president is. At the same time, there are separate laws that don't really depend on classification, that say documents that have a bearing on national security and defense posture cannot be taken out of secure locations, whether they're classified or not classified. And I think this goes to the sort of basic Trumpism that I think, I can't remember who one of my colleagues said it previously. Trump behaved like in the presidency the way he ran his business. He was the boss, everything belonged to him. It wasn't that he was taking over a trust from the American people for 4 years or 8 years, where he got to hold this office temporarily. It was that he owned it, and he owned the documents. So I think that obviously the most sort of sexy part of it is, and newsworthy part of it, is if these are serious national security documents about the US nuclear posture or somebody else's nuclear information. We're told that there were documents about the president of France. No idea what that is. Obviously, things with a national security component are troublesome, but it's the whole bunch of it. I mean, you just cannot, there are actually laws that say you cannot take this stuff from the White House, none of it. And so the extent to which it will become a legal matter for him and maybe a political matter depends on the national security component. But overall, it's anything he took that he is not allowed to take. And I think his argument that the president can declassify whatever he wants, and what his backers seem to be arguing is that in his head, at some point when he was president, he said, abracadabra, I declassify. Anything that I happen to take away is automatically declassified by virtue of me taking it away. I don't think that will stand up. None of this means that there are going to be charges or that he'll be convicted of anything. But I think what you've already seen, as Lauren said, despite the sort of knee-jerk instant reaction by the usual suspects among Republican office holders that, this is an outrage. This has never happened before. Well, Donald Trump has never happened before. As far as we know, no president has ever done this before. So of course it's never happened before that the FBI raided the residence of a former president. So I think that regardless if there are any charges, you may see this sort of chipping away. You already see some Republicans sort of saying, well, as Susan Collins has, well, we just need to know more, instead of this sort of, this is an outrage, never should have happened.
Right. Mark, just having returned to the UK from a little time off in the States and on vacation, what do you find about the succession race? How do you handicap that in the UK? Who's likely to succeed Boris Johnson?
Well, I guess the easiest way to put it is it's kind of just as I left it 3 weeks ago. Almost from the very beginning, once the field of candidates was narrowed down to 2 finalists, Liz Truss, who's the foreign secretary, and Rishi Sunak, who's the former chancellor of the Exchequer. Liz Truss jumped out to a very long and early and durable lead in the polls. Remember, this is not a race that involves the electorate at large. It's really a race among the somewhere between 160,000 and 200,000 people that are rank and file members of the Conservative Party. So it's a very rarefied slice of the British electorate that's going to make this decision. These are voters that tend in general to skew slightly older than the broader electorate. They also skew more conservative, even than many people who vote for Tories in general elections. And Liz Truss has, so far at least, played very effectively to this group of voters. She has promised a raft of tax cuts. She has channeled Margaret Thatcher both in fiscal policy and in foreign policy. And Margaret Thatcher is, of course, one of the great heroes of the Conservative Party, on a par with Ronald Reagan in the Republican Party. So at least until this moment, all the polling of these 160,000 or so people suggests that Liz Truss will be the next prime minister, but she'll inherit a very difficult and chaotic situation in this country with, inflation that's still in double digits, the prospect of a recession, skyrocketing energy prices, labor unrest. So it's going to be a very stormy tenure for whoever wins this contest. But as of this moment, as I said, 3 weeks ago when I left, Liz Truss was ahead in the polls and very much in the driver's seat. She remains there today. And barring something quite unexpected in the remaining 2 to 3 weeks of campaigning, she will probably emerge as the leader of the party and hence the prime minister. And she will have about 2 years to govern and try to get Britain through this difficult period before she will face the voters again in a general election, one that now looks far less of a cakewalk for the Conservatives than it might have a year and a half ago. Remember, Boris Johnson, like Margaret Thatcher, amassed a huge majority in Parliament. It's somewhere close to an 80-seat majority. And in general, when a party wins that kind of majority, it's very tough to get them out after one term in government. But given all the bad news, the messy exit of Boris Johnson, and the economic headwinds that lie in store, I think most people would say it's much more of a toss-up now who's going to be forming the next government in Britain. But there's less suspense around who'll be the next prime minister. It's likely to be Liz Truss.
Just quickly, how do these rank and file members of the Conservative Party express themselves? There's not a day when they go to vote, is there?
No,
Do they write letters or?
it's mail-in ballots, and this is one of the things that gives Truss perhaps an even greater advantage, which is that the ballots all went into the mail at the beginning of August, and by some accounts, 8 out of 10 people have already voted, have already cast their ballots. So, if you want to draw slightly far-fetched analogies to the United States, this is a little bit like the situation going into the 2020 election, when millions and millions of Americans had already voted by the time the polls opened. And that, of course, led to the memorable turmoil of election night, when Donald Trump initially looked like he was winning in several straight states where he eventually lost. We won't see anything close to that. But what the mail-in ballots does mean is that this election could be over, and we just don't actually know it yet. And it also means that for Rishi Sunak as the underdog, it's very hard for him to turn around the result at this point if many people voted back in early August, when Liz Truss was clearly on the front foot and propounding policies that were very popular and doing well in televised debates. It's hard to turn around an election like this when so many people may have already cast their ballots. So that's kind of where we are at this moment in the UK.
We want to urge people who are in the audience, if they want to ask questions, now would be sort of your last chance to submit one in the Q&A tab. We'll be going back to Mike in a second, but Rosina, if someone were to ask you to, on the basis of your work in Washington and so on and around this country until now, if someone were to ask you for a forecast of the midterm election results coming up in November, what would you say your reporting tells you?
I would say that it's very likely the Democrats lose the House. I think the Senate is still, I think it's still to be determined, and I think it's a bit of a fool's errand trying to guess the result at this point. But I think, yeah, I mean, everything so far suggests that, you know, the Republicans will take the House of Representatives, and the Senate will be very close either way. You know, it'll be, I don't think either party will get a strong majority in the Senate.
And Lauren, if, as you suggest, the Trump star is diminishing a little bit now, do you think, whom do you see as the likely alternative candidates for Republican nomination for president, who might win? And is Liz Cheney one of them? I read something this morning that Liz Cheney, though she will probably lose renomination tomorrow in Wyoming in the primary, that great things await her for 2024 among rank and file Republicans.
Okay, so the first part about the 2024 candidates, I mean, there's a few names that have been floating around, but again, so first and foremost, Governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, he's sort of seen as you know, he's kind of cut from the same cloth, mini Trump. He, you know, is in Florida. Trump is now a resident in Florida. He has been a close ally of Trump, but his recent sort of rise as a potential alternative has caused that relationship to sour. And we've seen him make some concerted moves to distinguish himself from Trump. But at the same time, you know, in the aftermath of this raid, he came, you know, he's the governor of Florida. He came, you know, to Trump's defense very strongly. So he's someone that's seen as possibly entertaining the idea whether he would want to take on Trump directly in the Republican primary, I think remains to be seen. And that, I think, is a big question for a lot of these younger generation Republicans. Do you want to take on Trump directly in the primary and risk losing to him? So that, but Ron DeSantis is the one that's named a lot, as well as Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota, I believe.
Yes, it is.
Brain lapse for a second. And she's, you know, sort of young rising star, famously offered Trump a miniature sketch of Mount Rushmore with his head on it. So as you can see, close ally. So would she take him on in the primary, or would she gun for maybe a vice president or running mate status? Who knows? So those are the two I think that get talked about a lot. But I think people are kind of biding their time, waiting to see how the midterms go and where. I do think this FBI search now has a few people thinking twice. Not everyone. Trump will always have his loyalists, but I think there's some people that are going to think twice. Do we want to go through this all? Republican establishment, very seriously weakened. They don't have a lot that they could do to actually stop, Trump from running again and Trump from winning the Republican nomination. But if they were to turn en masse, that could create some momentum. And lastly, Liz Cheney, if you listen to her speeches during the January 6th hearings, she does seem to be speaking to the American people. It has this rhetoric. It does sound like a campaign launch.
Right.
I think she would do it as some sort of kamikaze take down Trump. I don't think there's any way an independent wins in the US, but we'll see.
Right.
Anyway, that would
Okay. I'm going to cut you off there because I see Mike Scott is back and is going to tell us what the questions have been that have come in the past three
Well,
quarters
thanks
of an hour.
for an interesting 3/4 of an hour or so. A question: has the rhetoric of Trump and Johnson undermined, or at least confused, a popular belief in what is the truth, fake news or news? Who wants to take that?
I mean, I can take a crack at it. I think in the United States, it's indisputable that Trump's constant pounding on fake news and sort of congenital lying has in fact eroded, the public belief in what's real and what's not. And all you need for proof of that is to look at some of the polling data of how many people in America believe that the 2020 election was rigged, and particularly how many Republicans believe it was rigged. They're really eye-opening numbers. I think that in the UK, Boris Johnson has done a little bit of this, but much, much less malign and widespread than what Trump did in the United States. And I guess I would say that one major difference between these two societies that I think is critical is that in Britain, the most powerful broadcaster is a state-owned public broadcaster, the BBC. In the United States, arguably the most powerful television presence in society is Fox News, which has for the most part been Trump's handmaiden in spreading disinformation and helping him amplify his message. And so I think that one thing that has been actually very good news for the UK is there is no Fox in the United Kingdom. Yes, newspapers are more partisan in the United Kingdom, and a lot of them are pro-Tory and pro-Boris Johnson, or have been. But there is no analogy in the UK to Fox News. And so I think I would say that Johnson was more sparing in his use of these tactics than Trump, and B, he didn't have the most powerful megaphone in the media world to amplify that message. And I think that's the big difference.
Thank you. Any other comments on that, on the rhetoric, lies, truth, people believing it?
Add quickly,
Lauren.
Just to add, I think one element, and I'd be curious, maybe this is happening in the UK, and I don't know about it, but in the US, that Trump's rhetoric has helped amplify a lot of online violence, and we've seen some of that spill over into actual violence, and we've seen iterations of it. And I wouldn't say it's Trump alone, but there is an element, a violent element of it that we are seeing. And I just last week or a couple weeks ago wrote a story just speaking to experts who are really alarmed by the rise in violent rhetoric and how political speech has spilled over into political violence in the US. And I think they say constantly the simplest ways to address this is for political leaders to speak out. And obviously Trump was not someone who would condemn violence. In fact, on multiple occasions, he encouraged it. And so, absent Trump, you're not seeing that same condemnation from the other leaders of the Republican Party either. McCarthy in the House is, very loyal to Trump, and Mitch McConnell does speak out, but only on occasion and in very limited ways. And so I think in the absence of this, you're seeing this kind of violent rhetoric flourish, and we're seeing it right now in the aftermath of this FBI search of Trump's Mar-a-Lago house. The FBI has said, violent threats against our agents are skyrocketing, and it's a real problem.
Sorry, Rosina, carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to say on the rhetoric, as Lauren was saying, I think, a key difference between the impact of Boris Johnson's rhetoric and Donald Trump's is the handlehold they have on their respective bases. So, Donald Trump has an absolutely loyal following, and, incidents like January 6th last year when the attack on the Capitol was happening, I was outside the Capitol as it was being breached, and it was incredible just to see just how closely his supporters followed what he was saying. So, for instance, at the time, I had Donald Trump's tweets on notifications. So as soon as his video, from the Rose Garden went out, I saw it, and all around me, you saw loads of these rioters watching Trump speaking on their phones as they were walking to the Capitol, and then discussing what he was saying. So it's a very vivid illustration of just, how closely his base, and obviously those rioters don't reflect his entire base, but it's a good example of, how what Trump says has very direct impact on his base. I think that's quite different with Boris Johnson. I think, there was a tolerance for a lot of the controversial things he said because he was seen to be successful. And I think you saw a real anger from conservative voters when the Partygate story started to emerge. I think that anger has persisted. And obviously, ultimately, Boris Johnson didn't get away with his conduct because he is being forced from office. And I'm not sure that the same repercussions have followed for Donald Trump and his base.
Thank you. To carry on from that, Caitlin Mackay has asked, has Boris Johnson's rhetoric increased violence in the UK, similar to how Trump's rhetoric has increased violence in the US? Perhaps I'd also just add there that I don't think it has, but I'd like to go to Karen, because one of the issues I think in Britain was the fact that Johnson had there was a party at Downing Street the night before the monarch buried her husband, and we had that photograph of the Queen on her own. Was that widely shown over in the States as well, Karen?
Oh, sure. I mean, it was a fantastic picture, and I think that obviously there's no monarchy here, so there's nothing comparable. I think it was a little bit puzzling why that was such an ultimate sin for Johnson. I could see the lying, although compared to the lying here, all of it seemed relatively trivial. Having parties during COVID lockdown, if that were the least of our problems in terms of lawlessness and outrage among the government, I think we'd all feel a little bit calmer. So I don't think that people can necessarily relate to the reverence toward the monarch that's felt in Britain, whether you're a monarchist or not. I think people do hold certainly the Queen in a certain category and disrespect means a whole lot. That's a little bit hard to relate to here.
Yes, I think there's a huge respect for this monarch who's been on the throne for 70 years. So I think it did have a huge impact. What did you think, Mark? Were you in England at the time?
Yes, and what you said is of course true. That picture crystallized a sort of national protectiveness toward the Queen. And so when the disclosures came out about the parties held the night before, it just felt like a sort of a crass lack of respect. But to pick up on what Karen was just saying, there is an element to which I think people look back on the whole Partygate scandal and sort of wonder, why was this so unforgivable? He obviously lied about it and was dishonest. But in the scheme of things, when you look at the stuff that Trump did as president over 4 years, it does at times seem like it was a bit trivial. I think what it did, though, is it crystallized the larger character failings of Boris Johnson, this sort of inability to level with the public, this inability to tell the truth. And I think that's what chipped away at his public standing. One parenthetical point I'll make, because it has fascinated me since I came here, is just how different the Tory party has treated Johnson than the Republican Party toward Donald Trump. Despite the fact that Boris Johnson delivered them their largest parliamentary majority since Thatcher, they drummed him out of office, and they did so over a period of a few weeks. It's actually really kind of remarkable when you step back and look at it. One of the most popular Tory prime ministers, he can be forced out of power in a relatively short period of time. So swift, in fact, that there's been a little bit of seller's remorse. I think some people in the party have kind of been asking themselves over the past few weeks, particularly when faced with two rather uninspiring candidates for prime minister, party leader, whether this was in fact the right move or not. But either way, if you just look at the number of moments at which the Republican Party could have stood up, or other Republican leaders could have stood up against Donald Trump and said, this is a bridge too far, this is a step too far, we won't accept this, we won't accept that. And really, in every case, right up until the current moment with the investigation and the raid on Mar-a-Lago, you have not seen the Republican Party fall out of line with Trump. And by contrast, the Tory party took out a prime minister. And it's not as though it's a situation where the prime minister didn't have power. If you remember, when conservative lawmakers voted against Boris Johnson's Brexit package a couple of years ago, he threw about 30 of them out of the party. Party discipline does exist in Britain and in the Conservative Party, and yet the party mechanisms also provide for a way to push out a leader in a way that clearly in our presidential system in the United States just doesn't. There's no analogy for it, which is why, even though Lauren talked about this sense of misgivings or second thoughts or unease on the part of Republican leaders, we still haven't really even seen the glimmerings of a true party revolt against Trump in the US.
Well, what's interesting about Trump, I think, one of the many things is that, when you talk with people privately, office holders, many of them are not stupid. I mean, they, despite appearances, they understand what Trump's problems are. They understand what's happening, but they're so, again, because of the way the system works, these people have to run for office every 2 years in the House of Representatives. And right now, Trump is, as has been said, the most dominant Republican in the country, with a 70%, 80% approval rate among Republicans. And if you're a Republican office holder, in Congress and you've got to run for office, you cannot be in a position of saying, I'm going to stand up for my principles. Well, you could be in that position, but they choose not to be in that position because they would lose. And so I think that's that's part of the problem here. And until it is demonstrated that Trump does not have the hold over that vast majority of the Republican voters, you won't see people stand up against him in his own party.
And just to throw in very quickly, the big difference is that Boris's numbers, which had been really strong, began eroding. And so in some ways, what makes Trump impregnable in the US is what in the end proved to be, kryptonite for Boris Johnson. Once the conservatives fell behind the Labor Party in the polls, which they did, a lot of these Tory lawmakers began to fear that Boris was a liability at the polls. And that's, in a sense, why they turned against him. And we have, as Karen said, we're far from that moment in the United States for other Republicans.
I think I would
Thank you.
just to maybe add this to the conversation. In the wake of Trump losing the presidential election, we have seen so many of his loyalists now run for office, and we're seeing them win Republican primaries, and they're winning on these platforms, openly talking about frankly, election subversion, some of them, their embrace of anti-democratic norms. And I think this goes beyond, having a careless relationship with the truth. I mean, this is through, what democracy experts say is a real risk to US democracy.
Well, that leads nicely to Angela Preston's questions. I'm going to give actually another question from Mary Lynn Raish as well. So I'm going to give these three questions here because they're all very similar. Angela says, what do you think attracted voters to these men? And why do you think voters would vote for them again? And she adds that Boris Johnson and Donald Trump are known for misogyny. Why do you think voters have chosen men with disdain or prejudice against women? And Mary Raish says, how can we get working people to realize populists do not have their interests in mind at all? Brexit and US democracy are pretty important potential wreckage to the interests of those economically struggling, taking it out to other people economically struggling. Three questions around the same kind of area. Rosina, do you want to have a look at any of those?
Yeah, so I think on the question of what attracts people to these men, I think a really important thing to bear in mind is, if you look at Boris Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May, and, many of the former prime ministers before Boris Johnson, they gave quite robotic answers. Theresa May in particular was known for being quite robotic. And I think Boris Johnson just offered something different in that, you never really knew what to expect when you asked him a question and what answer you'd get. And I think that's also true of Donald Trump in that I think people see something refreshing in politicians who are willing to kind of break that mold and just kind of say what they're thinking at the time, or offer an unexpected response. Britain's former ambassador to Washington, Kim Darroch, has spoken about that connection between these two men and the way that really appealed to people. I think politicians have become so rehearsed in their responses, so formulaic, that the public had really, lost trust in those kind of, quite calculated, quite enigmatic responses to questions. And I think, whether or not Donald Trump and Boris Johnson were always giving candid responses, they were perceived to be, and they were perceived to be speaking to an electorate that I think felt ignored and unheard for a very long time.
Yeah. Mark, you're nodding on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Rosina just said. I mean, I think to the second half of that question you posed about how you deal with the fact that populists are often pushing policies that run against the interests of the people that support them. I think there's sort of a couple of answers to that. One is the people running against the populists have to develop a compelling contrary argument, one that convinces people why these policies run against their interests. And, you know, when they develop a compelling argument, they tend to do pretty well at the polls. I mean, Bill Clinton did that in 1992. Barack Obama did it. So it can be done. I do think also in this era of disinformation and the big lie, I think it's more incumbent than ever on us in the press to hold these populists to account and to make the case over and over again when, you know, policies are transparently at odds with the interests of working class people, to point that out. Now, many of these working class people aren't subscribing to the New York Times. We have to stipulate that. But it is part of our jobs as journalists to keep pushing, you know, shedding a light on that and pointing out these things. And frankly, even in this current race for prime minister in Britain, one of the things that's been striking about it is how untethered from reality many of the campaign promises are. Liz Truss is promising to cut taxes for everybody. No independent economist thinks that's the right way to deal with the current situation in the UK. So it's incumbent on us to point that out, among other things. And for people like the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, or whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being, President Biden or someone else, to make as muscular, as persuasive, as robust an argument against that as they can.
Thank you. One last question, which is almost a yes and no answer to each of you. Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, will they rise again? Yes or no? Lauren?
I don't think Donald Trump has totally fallen. He did lose, but he's still very much a political player. I feel like I write about him every single day. So in my life, he hasn't fallen. But yeah, I suppose I think it's very possible. I don't know about
Rosina.
So I think the question is, will Donald Trump run in 2024? I would lean towards yes. I think that there's not a question that if he does run, he will win the Republican nomination. And actually, the more anti-Trump, you know, figures that emerge, the better that is for him in terms of how the presidential primary system works. Boris Johnson, I tend to agree with what Mark said earlier, in that there will be more books, there will be more columns. He will definitely be a presence in British life for some time to come.
Karen?
I don't disagree with any of that. I think I learned in 2016 not to make pronouncements about Trump, since that was what everybody was asking, and I think everybody was wrong about it. He managed to see a niche, or was convinced by others to see a niche, and filled it with his own personality and way of doing things that resonated with people. Can he do that again? I think there's a lot of time now between now and the presidential primaries. I think that there will be some chipping away of support. The question is how much. However, his movement and the things that he has argued for, I think, will continue with the person whoever gets the nomination, because people, to the extent people are sort of tired of Trump drama, there is a sufficient minority, but a very large one in this country, that is not tired of those ideas. Boris Johnson, I agree with what Rosina said. I mean, I think, and Mark, I think that I'm not sure he'll re-enter political life, but I think he will be a political force.
Mark, is he a Chilean going to come back, or Is he just going to write his memoirs or write for newspapers?
Well, as someone who wrote a book about Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign, I also have decided to swear off any kind of soothsaying about the future. I think, among the questions that Boris Johnson needs to ask himself is whether he can afford to be prime minister. He's a man with several ex-wives, multiple children, and a taste for an expensive lifestyle. And I think being prime minister has actually cramped his style. So, whether he can stock up enough cash to make it worth his while to try again is one of the things we'll have to wait and see. And as far as the US goes, obviously never bet against Trump. But, I just to underscore what Karen and Lauren said, I mean, there is a lot of time here. There were a lot of unanswered questions around these legal cases swirling around him. There is this latent but very, very noticeable uneasiness in the Republican Party. And, by the way, if you look at the national polling, he doesn't actually win in a head-to-head with Joe Biden at the moment. I think it's very close. So, I think that just as it was possible to kind of sleep on Trump winning in 2020, it's also possible to overdo the horror of his potential reelection. So, I mean, the best thing is to be humble and say, I don't know. I mean, if any of you do, the secret to success.
Sandy, would you like to answer that question and say anything else?
Well, I ought to try some
Oh, Sandy, you're breaking up.
I'm sorry, I don't know why that's happening. Is it better now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, better now.
I believe I should try to keep some independence as the moderator. I personally believe that democracy is in grave danger in the United States. That's why I'm putting so much time into this free speech project at Georgetown. So I am having a little trouble distinguishing between what I think will happen and what I'm afraid will happen. And so I have to concede that. I do agree that there are some chinks in Trump's armor at the moment, but whether they're adequate, when you see voters endorsing these candidates to be secretaries of state who are basically promising to steal elections, that's terribly worrisome. But I think Trump is losing some of his voters. I don't know. What I know about Boris Johnson is that he does seem like this person who is quintessentially able to redesign himself from time to time, and maybe that will work in the UK as well. There are big questions about the opposition in both countries and it seems to me whether anyone can rise to defeat the parties in the way that we're wondering about. Anyway, let me just conclude, Mike, as we do, by thanking these brilliant panelists. We were very wise in getting these 4 people to participate in this discussion. And I think this has been quite interesting. Will attract a significant audience online afterwards as well. Thanks, as usual, to the people at Georgetown who support this quirky project of Mike Scott's and mine, including Jack DeJoy, the president of the university, and Tom Banchoff, the vice president for international affairs, and all the people who work with us, most especially John McCabe, to keep things going. And I hope the audience today will come back. Next month, we're going to talk about the case of Julian Assange, and one of our guests will be Daniel Ellsberg, and talk about what the charges against him mean, whether he'll ever go to trial, and what happens to the media in America if he gets convicted. That is going to be on September 19th, if I'm not mistaken. So thanks to you, Mike, too, for all our good work together.
Okay, well, thanks to you, Sandy, and thanks to Karen DeYoung, Mark Lander, Rosina Saber, and Lauren Gambino for such an interesting. I've been fascinated by the discussion this afternoon, and we'll see how things progress. As Sandy says, the next free speech as a crossroads, international dialogues. It's going to be a special one. It's going to be 2 people rather than 4. It's going to be Naomi Colvin, the UK and Ireland director for Blueprint for Free Speech, who has actually given a prize to Dan Ellsberg for the way that he's helped the activist Julian Assange in the future. So as Sandy said, that's on Monday, the 19th of September. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Please tune in for that. As well as our thanks to Georgetown, thanks to the people at Campion Hall, Nick Austin, the master of the hall, Trudy Preston, Ying, the Campion Hall administrators, and at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the regent, and Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute. My thanks to John McCabe, and also to my publicist, Laura Lees, and to Maggie Scott. I would also like to thank all of you who have asked questions. Quite a lot came in right at the end, and we weren't able to ask them all. But I think actually that the discussion had answered many of them as we went along. Thank you for attending today and for all your support of our various series, especially to Sandy, who's the director of the Free Speech Project in Georgetown. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until next time in September, take care, keep safe, and goodbye. And thanks everybody again. Goodbye.